Oh, there we go. Let me start that again. So again, I'm Carter McNabb from GRA, one of the partners and founders. And I'll be presenting today along with David Drummond and Dan Knox, who can now unmute themselves.
Thanks, Carter.
Hey guys, if you press the space bar, you can unmute yourself.
But not unless Carter lets us. He holds all the power. Thanks, Carter. I'm Dan from GRA, and looking forward to chatting to you all today. Thank you.
And David Drummond, I'm a director from the Sydney office and looking forward to presenting parts of the segment today.
Okay. Thank you, David. All right, so for the webinar portion, I'll present along with Dan and David. Right now, I do have it set up so that I'm the only person who can unmute participants, and we're just doing that to minimize the background noise. When we get to sections of the presentation that Dan and David are presenting to, I'll unfreeze that again and allow them to unmute and come back on. And again, we're just doing that to make sure we don't have a lot of background noise for the actual presentation. If you have any questions, there's a chat function in Zoom. So if you move your cursor down to the lower portion of your screen, it should come up and there'll be a little dialog box that says chat. So if you have any questions or comments along the way, feel free to put them in the chat and send that to everyone. So you'll have an option to send it to individual members or everyone. Please send to everyone. And when we get to the end of the presentation at the end, we'll go through a bit of a Q&A that Dan Knox will moderate. And we'll take the questions as they appear in order and answer those. And then if anyone has any comments they'd like to make or contribute to that answer, there's an option to raise your hand, which is like an icon that will come up against your name. And then we will unmute you and you can come in and contribute to that discussion as well. Dan will moderate that when we get to that point. I also want to say a really big thanks to 6 Degrees Executive for their assistance in organizing the event, in particular John Whitehead, who I've been working with very closely on this, as we have in the past. So thanks to 6 Degrees and John. I'll now switch over to my screen in terms of the PowerPoint pack, and we can start going through the presentation. So the agenda for today is to really just do some orientation around the global story today. So how has it impacted the world globally in terms of the economy and also health implications. And then we'll sort of bring that down to a little bit more granular level in terms of how that's impacted Australia and Australian supply chains. We'll then break that down into an industry assessment, because what we've certainly seen is some disruption and chaos and shifts in different industries and in different sectors. So we'll have a look at how different sectors have performed and what that has meant in terms of supply chain. And then I think the really important part of the discussion is, what does it mean for moving forward? So are we seeing any new capabilities that perhaps were once seen as a competitive advantage that might now be seen as a fundamental necessity? What are the lessons learned? And what are some of the capabilities that we need to enhance to be successful moving forward? So yeah, it wasn't a tough topic to find something that was interesting to a group. But again, I know there's a bit of webinar fatigue at the moment, so we do appreciate your time and participation today. I also appreciate the fact that I can wear a suit on the top, but you have no idea what I'm actually wearing on the bottom half. So that'll just stay my secret for the duration of the presentation. All right. So I'm just going to very quickly tell you a little bit about GRA. We're a supply chain consultancy. We focus on supply chain strategy, planning, and execution. We've been around for 24 years now. Offices across Australia in 4 locations and a team of over 60 people. This is a sampling of some of our clients. We work across multiple industries, so everything from FMCG to retail to aerospace and defense, mining and resources, manufacturing, distribution, health, and defense and government. Yeah, and we've certainly seen some changes in the types of demand that we've seen for our services. We've actually done some work in the health sectors. So in New South Wales, we worked with the hospitals group to implement an operational planning process and a logistics process for management of PPEs, continuity and supplies into a hospital group. And David will tell you a little bit more about impacts in the health industry today. All right, so if we look at the global story to date, it's an interesting one. I guess coronavirus cases globally are now well above 3 million, with more than 1 million in the United States alone. Some key themes that are coming out are resilience and efficiency. So resilience, there's been some research done by McKinsey, and it looked at organizations that had, well, how they were positioned pre-crisis and how they came out post-crisis. And interestingly, businesses that scored high on measures of resiliency tended to bounce back quite a bit better than the businesses that didn't have that resiliency. So that meant a little bit more safety in terms of its financial position and its supply chain. So interestingly, on the surface, that might be a business that doesn't look quite as attractive from a capital allocation perspective, but at the same time had some safeguards in place. And again, these businesses tended to bounce back much more quickly and be more successful in the long run post-crisis. Having said that, efficiency is still important, but views of efficiency are changing, perhaps. And so now there's some questions around the way that we've traditionally looked at supply chains as quite lean and highly efficient. Maybe that needs a rethink. There's also a view that the investment community will likely take note and devise ways to incorporate resiliency more systematically into their valuations. We're also seeing the rise of the contact-free economy. I'm sure you're all having some experiences with that as well, with increases on online shopping, telemedicine, and virtual health. There's also a lot more government intervention in the economy. By mid-April, governments across the world had announced stimulus plans of about $10.6 trillion. That's the equivalent of 8 Marshall Plans. So huge amounts of government support across the world. And again, that's increased since that time. And we're also seeing changing industry structures, consumer behavior, market positions, and sector attractiveness as well. So a lot of change. If we bring this back to Australia, the top the top left-hand corner of the slide has a quote from Scott Morrison saying it was unprecedented for a government to be required to select a course of action that would be in effect choosing between health and economy. And so again, there's this question of, well, do we keep the economy open and risk a higher level of contagion and outbreak, or do we put some lockdown and dampening measures in place, and as a result, flatten the curve? However, I guess what's interesting about that is current analysis shows that these are perhaps more interdependent than what we thought. So scenario forecasts show a persisting economic impact where the virus isn't contained. So yes, it's a short-term or a long-term view. So a lockdown might have had some shorter-term economic impacts. But the idea is that if that hadn't happened and there was a higher level of contagion, that there could be a bigger economic impact that lasted for longer. So I think it was actually a simultaneous decision, interestingly, as opposed to an independent one. But all that being said, it really has supported Australia's decision to flatten the curve, and Australia has done quite well with that. So I think the view is that we've seen the peak and are now looking at a staged return back to something that looks more like normal, although normal will likely be different moving forward. Interestingly, though, as much as we've done a good job here in Australia managing this, we're not immune to the global system. The IMF is forecasting a decrease in GDP and an increase in unemployment in 2020. So you can see that over on the right-hand side, where the GDP is expected to decrease by 6.7%, and then unemployment going up to around 10%. Now, we haven't really seen this flow through just as yet in the Australian economy, and one of the views is that the government stimulus has not, again, made us immune from this, but has delayed it and has mitigated it, but again, hasn't delayed it. But we also need to take this into account into our scenario planning, looking into the future. Very, very important. So I think there's a sense of optimism at the moment, which is great, but again, be cognizant of the possibility that there could be some economic softness later in the year. And again, when we're doing our scenario planning, these are the sorts of things that we need to take into account. And we'll talk a bit more about scenario planning as the presentation continues, as we see this being one of the key capabilities that needs to be implemented moving forward. As you're likely aware, the government yesterday implemented step 1 of its restart roadmap, with pauses between steps to assess impacts, revise plans accordingly, and take action. And again, this highlights the need for scenario planning and a roster of options with implementable action and plans based on key possibilities. So in other words, if this all happens sequentially, so we move from step 1 and the government pauses and watches and says, yes, it's now safe to move to step 2, and then pauses and watches and says, now it moves to step 3. That's one scenario. But another scenario is, what if we move to step 1 and then go to step 2, but then move back to step 1? Or what if we move from step 1 to step 2 and go back to step 3 and move back to step 2 or back to step 1? So again, the need to really consider what the possible scenarios are, and then map out some options, and then make sure that there's some implementable plans that sit behind those, and we have the ability to execute. That's really, really important. And again, the ability to efficiently and effectively communicate with supply chain stakeholders is also very, very important. So that speed of communication and the ability to be pre-positioned to take action and act quickly with confidence, again, very, very important. Okay. So there were some other countries that took similar action to Australia, so other ones that moved quickly into testing, to lockdown. Interestingly, it was some of the countries that had some experience via SARS, so they seem to be, in general, much better positioned than other countries to deal with this. So they approached the crisis in a similar way. So in addition to the now obvious changes in market sector demand, such as PPE supplies and online retail, what can we learn from these countries about Australia's economic outlook? So if you have a look at what happened with China from their peak, and then what's occurred, and also South Korea from their peak, noting that Australia's peak was a little bit delayed. If you look over at Australia, I mean, Australia in some ways looks like it had done better. Again, that's also because of the government stimulus, a lot of panic buying that occurred. But the story, if you just look at those numbers, would say, yeah, things have actually gotten better. If we look at what's happened, say, in China and Korea, again, there tends to be a lag effect. And we really don't have the figures yet coming from Australia to have a clear picture of what will occur as a result of this. Okay. So Australia is still charting its road out of lockdown. In China, a lot of the online retailers saw tremendous growth, 220% and 470% out of Alibaba and JD.com respectively. So quite huge. Same with Korea. Again, we're seeing this in Australia as well. Now schools and department stores in those economies have started to reopen or have reopened, and now Australia is contemplating the same. So I think it's a good message. But again, the signals that some of the research is showing is that Australian households are reasonably pessimistic. So consumer sentiment and demand may be still dampened. So this graph here shows the level of optimism in terms of household spending. And so the further to the bottom left of that chart that you go, it shows that represents a lesser amount of optimism or a greater amount of decrease in spending. So Australia's pretty far down in that particular section. And over on the right-hand side, it shows various countries and their views on category spending. And anything red is showing a decrease. Anything blue is either staying the same or an increase. And again, what that's saying is, pretty broadly, there's a decrease, although some home-based style categories seem to be enjoying quite an uptick as a result of the situation. So again, a lot of turbulence and a lot of mix and change across various sectors. So I think that's been a theme, which is the unpredictability of consumer behavior. So we saw some panic buying. Again, it's funny, this happened a couple months ago, but of course it now feels like very old news in terms of coronavirus. Interestingly, we were gonna do this presentation last week, but had to reschedule. And even since last week, we've already made some updates to the presentation because the situation is evolving quite quickly. All right. So given the turbulence and chaos of both demand across sectors and the bullwhip effect within sectors, let's now have a look at what's happened in some key industries. So the COVID, as we know, completely reshifted the landscape in terms of what was seen as essential. I think it also highlighted that Australia was lacking, quite thin, in what might now be seen as some critical infrastructure. So if you looked at, for example, PPE supplies, there's only one PPE, and this is of masks, manufacturer in Australia, Medcon. I actually spoke to the CEO of Medcon at the start of this whole thing, and my view was that it was quite a large company, but then I found out they had about 12 team members and 2 machines based up in Goulburn. And they had the military that had come in to help them add some capacity. And there'd been some investment by the government to increase the number of machines they had and so on. But what he was saying is that, it was all on price, that overseas imports had really driven the local industry away. And they had just barely hung on because they had come up with a new technology that made the manufacturing process more efficient. And that's now being scaled back up in Australia. But what happened is not only could we not get supplies, but even the ones that could manufacture locally couldn't get the raw materials. So it was 2 questions: is that who are the primary producers, and then where do those primary producers get the raw materials? And in both of those cases, Australia was seen to be short. So I think it'll raise some questions around what critical infrastructure is and what the government may be investing in moving forward. And again, if you take away, say, Taiwan and Korea, following SARS, you saw similar measures being put in place. What we also saw is that nimble or agile manufacturers tend to do quite well in the situation. So ones that were able to pivot fairly efficiently, retool and change over, whereas manufacturers with more of a rigid cost base were left more exposed. So again, there's an argument around this question around efficiency as opposed to being a little bit more nimble. Again, it's a thing that we see coming up quite a bit in discussions around supply chain moving forward. All right, so I am now, going to get David to join us. Give me 1 moment. It looks like I need to adjust my settings. 1 moment, please. You there? Thanks, David.
Okay, thanks, Carter. So some of the responses we see within the retail sector, certainly there was a significant increase in sales as seen by the graph at the top. We're all familiar with, the panic buying that happened in food and grocery, the decline in restaurant sales and cafes and bars. And I guess one sector pushed demand into the other. Result of that, Woolies 320% increase in app shoppers. Obviously the panic buying and the demand in stores and the like led people to try and buy online. That patterns continued. They had to hire another 20,000 people largely to get the stock on the shelves and meet that increase in demand. Coles went through a similar phase of massive recruitment. Australia Post for online has seen a massive increase, 80% increase in parcel deliveries. And Myer, on the other hand, stood down 10,000 staff as they had to close stores and just didn't have demand. But as their on-site sales grew, they moved into rehiring staff in that space. So online's been growing for a number of years, but this has certainly been a game changer for bricks and mortar to find a way to push volume through the retail sector. If we move to the next slide, Carter. Where are we? So this exponential increase in demand has driven some retailers in dark stores. They've been around for a while, but they're moving away from DC to customer. That significant demand, coupled with the inability of their online to cope with the growth, retailers in particular who had bricks and mortar stores not being used for any meaningful purpose, moved across to utilising them as dark stores. We've got the example there with Amazon turning some of their whole food markets into dark stores. Kmart in Australia has closed 3 stores that have been turned into online fulfillment centres, one in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. Where we go from here, does that change? There's certainly a big push to meet that spike in demand for online purchase, which couldn't be fulfilled through bricks and mortar. So the delivery model for online really needs to step up moving forward. The significant growth means expectations will continue from the market. A lot of the, I guess, response to COVID is we're all forced to change our behaviours, and the online retail market is going to have to find a way to fulfil going and sustainable, because the demand may not shift fully back to where it used to be. If we move into slide 20, next one, with the health services sector. So personal protective equipment, PPE, demand surge, we're all familiar with. Global shortages, lots of countries can't get enough supply, and obviously a critical element to ensure that people are kept safe in hospitals. How did it happen? Well, the issues arose. There's talent gaps within the supply chain and capability. The health supply chain hasn't needed the level of maturity that you might get in FMCG. There's limited resilience in their resources supply. A lot of health equipment comes through centralised government channels, and it's through procurement programs that are not heavily focused on shift in demand or change in profile. The limitations on logistics process is all a fairly balanced and consistent business as usual, but then things changed. The demand exceeding supply, it led to a need to allocation mix and challenges where centralised government-based health facilities that were holding stocks on behalf of multiple consumers, and that includes GPs as well as the public hospital system. They had to work out how to allocate and prioritise where it goes, and that resulted in a cutback in the GP space. It resulted in cutback in elective surgeries to create capacity and available stocks to go to COVID-19 demand, and we're seeing that all shift gradually. There's also limited, I guess, specification and quality control. So whilst it's fairly diligent and controlled, the ability to source from somewhere alternate to the current supply and make sure that there was a procedure to meet compliance was certainly very challenging. So there's a real gap across the whole sector in terms of, I guess, skills in all aspects of supply chain and procurement and supply of demand when there's a change in requirement. When we look at, I guess, GRA response to that as an example here in the graph. So we've all seen that the graphs within the media and from the government, PPE demand at which current system can cope. So there's, I guess, a flat line running out where it's fairly consistent. There is a demand that's then shifted. It's shifted by cancelling elective surgeries to increase the capacity of the current equipment to meet demand, but it's all based on a forecast of what COVID might look like, and that's based on overseas experience. Australia had the luxury of following others, looking at what happened overseas and seeing where a rapid outbreak can result in a massive increase in demand and the inability to cope. So GRA has 8 elements of the PPE supply chain operating model, and they're fundamental to most business, but relevant here in the health sector we've worked through. It's forecasting requirements, and it's had to be based on a global COVID-19 data and looking at what happened elsewhere rather than just historical. Stock take accuracy and program for current hospital equipment. The health system is just used to clinicians use the equipment they have and they expect it to be there, but there's no real diligent process to control the issuing and what happens with it. Clarify and establish visibility on source of supply. And as I said earlier, this has typically been often a single source of supply for key things which come from a state government or a federal government arrangement, to looking for alternatives because the demand is greater than they expect to be served with. Set up transport model and parameters for any new channels, and this is a lot of the work that we did recently, as Carter alluded to, that is still ongoing. It's just making sure that you're finding alternate channels, you have means of getting those goods through into the supply chain. Review of current stores layout, loading, dock, receiving, so making sure that the increase in goods can come in, be stored, can be issued efficiently and effectively on a 24/7 operation. Review of centralised stock management effectiveness. So some of the supply chains are sourcing and it's all going directly into a hospital and into a theatre, into a ward, into a wherever. but no real accuracy around what inventory is held in there, and how do they then bolster stocks to cope with increased usage without the capacity within all those wards to take a lot more stock. So better centralised stock management and effectiveness. Designing organisation supply chain structures to make sure that as a team, they're making sure that they can source the goods, move them through supply chain and get them to the point they need to be and keep track. And the last of the 8 is establish dashboards and reports that highlight the inventory levels and targeted action. So a very clear plan of identify all the issues currently, resolve them, train the people up to perform them, and then provide support. Some of that support that we provided in the work we've been doing included sourcing of additional storage capacity on site, setting up of the operation to receive more of the stock, and the layout in preparation, people to issue the stock out and make sure that there is controls over which department gets what or which hospital gets what, and that demand has to be then balanced across multiple hospitals, multiple wards within the hospitals and theatres to make sure that every nurse can have the protective equipment that you can see in the picture there on the right that they need to have. So that was, I guess, our plan of how to deal with PPE. It relates broadly to a lot of areas in supply chain, and it's been executed over the last 7 weeks or so with hospitals within the New South Wales system to make sure that they are able to supply what is needed throughout this tough time. Thanks, Carter.
Okay, I'll take you through the fast-moving consumer goods outlook, industry outlook. And I guess for those of you who have played the beer game, the 1980s, I think supply chain simulation game out of, which came out of MIT, this graph would be very familiar to you, the concept of the bullwhip effect. We've seen almost unprecedented demands come through our retailers at this point, creating massive spikes in demand, affecting manufacturers and raw material suppliers that we try to keep up. The key challenge for the manufacturing or fast-moving consumer goods team now is the back end of this. How do we transition out? And we've all seen those images of the shopping carts full of toilet paper. Yes, we are working from home a bit more, but I would struggle, and I'd think maybe you might have a medical condition if you are actually consuming all of that toilet paper at once. So you kind of know at the back end somewhere, there will be a demand reconciliation that will need to happen. And the winners out of the fast-moving consumer goods are the teams who can plan agile, so they can update their forecasts and translate that through to manufacturing plans in a very quick and efficient manner. Because whilst it's great from the retailer side, a lot of the fast-moving consumer goods, food service and route businesses also not seeing the demand. So a lot of that demand has shifted into the retail, which has meant large pressures being put on the ability to supply, and it's been exposing especially our raw material holdings as we've been using more of a just-in-time approach. A lot of the FMCG community now are reassessing what's the most appropriate strategy and should we be holding more of our inputs locally. Go to the next slide. Thanks, Carter. So coming out on the other side, when we're restarting on the consumer goods, there's 3 sort of main areas we're looking at. The first and most important is we need to work with our suppliers. So reviewing your current position, understanding what is the capability and capacity of your current suppliers. Are they open? Are they closed? Have they the ability to actually supply all of your demands? Assessing critical nodes in your supply chain and understanding where you do have redundancy and flexibility, and maybe you might need to assess where you have to have dual supply, and looking at how your suppliers can flex. You need to understand the risks in the network. What's the position if we do have another outbreak? As Carter mentioned before, if we have to step back to phase 1 and maybe we do see another spike in demand, what's our ability to respond to that? And are we also vulnerable to global hoarding behaviours? So it's not just our demand that we've got to look after. And to review and work in collaboration with our suppliers in a lot more closely than we ever have before. The second part is identifying new customer norms. So yes, we have seen unprecedented increases in demand. I mean, many of the FMCG community you talk about, we've had Christmas volumes over and over again. So we need to review what is true demand going forward and what's our capability and capacity to be able to assess and deliver to that demand. Now, we've seen a lot of organisations are starting to review their own abilities to go B2C. So we've seen things like Heinz implementing their own B2C offerings. And it's also exposed, I guess, a lot of the main retailers' capacities around the scalability of online. So it's not just about your own offering and even the IT, it's also about your ability to execute around increased demands on click and collect and even your last mile operator. Have they got the capacity and the ability to deliver once you scale up? We also need to review our inventory policies. So let's have a look at the March-April demands and assess what is the true demand profiles going forward. So it's not necessarily historic, but we might have some true changes in consumer behaviour that we now need to map. And we also have to look at our low-risk inventory and target that for promotional activity to make sure that we're not stuck with inventory that's not going to move anymore. And then finally, it's about protecting our teams and customers. So where you do have client-facing opportunities or customer-facing opportunities, it's about understanding each team member's interaction processes, whether they're field force, sales forces, or whether you actually have staff stores or actual stores, and looking at how we actually now remap the flows within these areas. And that could include offices as well, maybe separate entry and exit processes. How do we minimize contact and maintain the distance? And there's some companies are using clever technology like wristbands and other things like that to help keep the 1.5 metre distance. Also, you may need to review things like having a COVID-19 officer, like we have health and safety officers, to ensure that all the processes and procedures are maintained. We'll also need to train our team members in the effective use of PPE and all the protective inventory, and that we have suitable inventories, just like we do with our finished goods, that we have our suitable protective gear in our locations. And again, I mentioned we need to reconfigure our store layouts to make sure we can keep social distancing, and then understand if we do have outbreaks, what are the processes and procedures to quickly handle those. Thank you, Carter.
Thanks very much, David and Dan. So for now, we move on to the future view. The question is, what are the critical capabilities for Australian organisations moving forward, and what are the key lessons that we've learned from COVID-19? I think one of the big things that comes up is scenario planning. Excuse me. So this is some analysis done by McKinsey, and this is a matrix which really shows different scenarios that are possible, ranging from rapid and effective control of virus spread through to, my apologies, highly effective interventions. So if you look at A4 on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side, is the most optimistic. Virus is fully contained, strong growth rebound. And then if we kind of look at the lower left-hand corner, this says it's a broad failure of public health interventions and ineffective interventions, then there's an escalation, it's prolonged without economic recovery. So that's the not so good situation. So I'm going to now pull out just scenarios A3 and A1 to have a look at those two, because they're actually fairly close. But if we then kind of drill into the detail about what this means for GDP, we can see they're actually quite different. And this is where, again, I think it highlights the need for scenario planning. So this is scenario A3. So this is the virus being contained. And under this scenario, the GDP returns to pre-crisis levels by calendar Q4 2020. So again, if we're doing scenario plans, our questions might be, what are our options and action plans under the scenario? What will demand look like? So what will our demand look like under this? And how is my supply chain and how are my suppliers positioned given this kind of an outlook? So, do we have the redundancy and resiliency and the ability to keep operating under this sort of a change? And then what does that mean when things start picking up in terms of the demand increasing? How we're going to make sure that we can meet that demand, get allocated capacity, you know, both from the transportation side of things and also the supply side of things to make sure we can kind of keep up. So again, that kind of return from the crisis is very important because it can kind of set up an organization's market position from there. What I think's perhaps a bit more interesting, though, is that if we now look at a scenario A1, which again didn't appear to be too far apart in the matrix graph that showed the various scenarios, but this is now saying the GDP returns to pre-crisis levels in calendar Q3 2022, so approximately 2 years later than the previous scenario. So same questions as before. What will demand look like under this scenario? How is my supply chain and my suppliers positioned in this case? Is survival now a question? What are our options and action plans that we need to put in place? And so our argument would be is that we need to have a clear view of kind of what the higher level strategic possibilities are, and then to start mapping out different options. What will we do if? And again, so the first step is to map out what are those possible options. Then what sort of, how do we orient ourselves in terms of coming up with some ways we might respond to that? And then how do we make decisions when we hit certain trigger points? And then how do we actually take action? And again, having a pretty clear view of that in advance is quite important. So a possible model for that. So OODA, O-O-D-A, excuse me, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide and Act, was actually created by John Boyd, who was a colonel in the US Air Force. And his ideas on how to do this kind of revolutionized the way the US government, the US military looked at scenario planning. And the reason why there's two circles in the graph is because his view was if you can observe, orient, decide and act faster than the changes in the environment, that's what sets you up for success. You have to be able to do this faster than what's actually happening. And so I'll break this down in a little bit more detail. Observe and orient are really looking at the future, whereas decide and act are kind of looking at the present. Having said that, all of these activities need to be happening at the same time. In other words, we need to be doing the observe and orient now into the future, with our previous plans now informing the present. I mean, fundamentally, this is similar to an evolved integrated S&OP process. So you could look at this as a form of integrated business planning, which takes strategic planning, organizational orientation, and puts it into action. And if we kind of step through this, I'm going to go through the more near term to the longer term. But that 1 to 4 week period is where we're really looking to understand the exposure. And this is really looking at near term. Given the amount of content on these slides, I'm not going to go through these point by point, but we can share the presentation pack following that, and I'll give you some contact details to do that at the end. But again, this is getting a very near-term view and really looking at ensuring the supply chain has the ability to pivot and meet demand. And as Dan spelled out before, the ability to kind of protect our teams and our suppliers in terms of how we're doing things. So, I mean, this is as much about understanding new demand signals, better levels and different levels of forecasting, reorganization of the supply chain, i.e. the dark store model in retail, and then looking at those possibilities of different supply sources and channels in that short term. It's also about then, if we are operating, what are the distancing requirements? Do warehouses need to be relaid out? We've seen actually a couple of our clients move into this, actually starting to change the way that the warehouse and storage facilities are structured. Interestingly, that means they're actually, in some cases, taking some equipment out of those facilities. So in some cases, these may be restaurants and food service areas. And then those are now being stored in the warehouses, which is actually putting more capacity into the warehouse in terms of, it's consuming more capacity in the warehouse. So you kind of got to think about this stuff at a pretty detailed level to make sure that we don't get caught out by something that was unforeseen. The decide process is really then around improving the stability. So it's really making sure that our operational processes, as we're learning, are getting encoded into the way that we do business. So some sort of kind of a nerve center, supply chain center of excellence that's kind of being used to integrate this, digitizing those processes and tools around demand and supply and capacity planning. And again, to make sure we've got that stakeholder engagement and moving forward. And again, in this kind of time frame, we're very focused on collaborating with our upstream and downstream supply chain. orient now is we're saying, well, do we need to actually start changing the business model or the operating model based on what we're seeing? So business continuity planning becomes very important. Do we need to restructure the supply base accordingly? Development of very comprehensive category strategies with a focus on risk management and business continuity. And we need to start asking questions, as it says over on the right-hand side. My apologies. Has just-in-time had its time? Can we adapt and move to more sophisticated replenishment methods, away from min-max and reorder point methods, which, as boring as that may sound at one level, I mean, they're not particularly flexible and adaptive when it comes to rapid changes and situations where we don't have stable or regular demand. Can we afford to run as lean in the future? And how well do you understand the tiers in our supply chain, our suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers? So, this question around scenario planning and then supply chain resilience, I think, are two of the very key things that are coming out of this. And if I move to the last one, then this comes down to the scenario planning capability overall. Now, so scenario planning at a very high level is something that says what are the possible pathways moving forward, and then based on that, how do we want to respond? I've kind of covered that at a high level before. But I just wanted to mention that we do have a partnership with the Australian Food and Grocery Council. So every 2 years, we do an industry supply chain survey with the Australian Food and Grocery Council. And the most recent one we did, it was really interesting because, and this is FMCG. So I'd say FMCG in Australia is one of those industries that does generally has had more investment put into people and systems and processes. You'd likely see a higher level of S&OP in FMCG than in a lot of other industries as a whole. So 89% of the survey respondents, which again were FMCG businesses, said they had a formal S&OP process in place, but only 60% identified scenario planning capability. Well, sorry, 60% said it was either non-existent or insufficient. So that's kind of interesting, is that even though we've had all this investment in S&OP and systems, that it's still very much kind of a demand and supply balancing piece, and not giving us that kind of ability to make the longer term scenario planning decisions. So why is that? I think it's really two things. We need to have both reliable information. What I mean by reliable information is data that's integrated from the bottom up and top down. So it's granular, it's accurate, it's not multiple versions of the truth. In addition, we have to have the right culture. So a culture that's based on trust and transparency, where there are known roles and responsibilities and decision rights, and where there's trigger points. So what actions do I take when certain things happen? So one organization that has a more evolved scenario planning process is Simplot. And those are some of the lessons that we learned in working with them. What they shared with us was they did have a level of structure and organization and good enough data to be able to build this sort of picture, which meant they could get one version of the truth, both operationally and financially, that would move into the future, and they could use that for scenario planning. But I'd say in some businesses we've seen there's good information, but the cultural mechanisms aren't really strong enough to hold it together, or again, the cultural intention's great, but we don't have the data, and again, it takes both of those things. Okay, so if we look at this moving forward in summary, one of the key things is supply chain resilience. So again, what do we now think about just in time, or working with a small number of low cost suppliers that give us better gross margin? Again, not saying that's a bad thing, but again, there may be some strategies around making sure we're funding multiple supply sources, just so that we actually have some allegiance, some good relationships, and that built in. Inventory profiles, stocking policies is a question. There'll be some questions for the government as well about critical infrastructure. And again, I think looking at some improved planning processes, forecasting and planning would be helpful in that as well, which leads to the next point is, managing cash flow is still very key in this sort of environment. So inventory optimization and, kind of responsive replenishment planning, again, moving away from the traditional kind of min-max ROP, ROQ methods. That's important. Again, also important if we're going to support scenario planning capabilities. We're focusing on testing and trialing environments, particularly for online fulfillment. But again, these are part of the, this is the kind of the way at the moment, which is finding a hypothesis, experimenting with it, at one scale, and then rolling that out as appropriate. We're also going to be seeing an increase in scenario planning capabilities. Again, I think this was kind of seen as a luxury, but it's becoming a necessity. And I think be interested to hear others' experience with this in their business, but I would assume there'd be a whole lot more of that happening across the board. Given some changes in demand and also prices, it might be an opportunity to review some transport contracts at this point. And it also highlights an increasing requirement for supply chain talent, because now we're seeing, I guess, when a pressure is put on the supply chain, we can see how much more integrated it is and how many disciplines it does go across. So having people who can kind of sit in the scenario planning space, in the supply chain nerve centers, to help and kind of restructure and then implement the new processes and technology to support the way forward become very, very important. All right, so I will pause there. I'll just put up this slide with a series of lovely pictures. If you would like a copy of the presentation, feel free to email John Whitehead, for those of you that have come through 6 Degrees, and or just email me. My email is there at cmcnab@gra.net.au. I'd be happy to share the presentation with you. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is hand over to Dan. So Dan, I'll hand over to you so you should all be able to unmute yourselves if that's what you would like to do. And Dan, I'll hand over to you for moderation of discussion.
All right. Thank you, Carter. So just putting it out there, is anyone any questions or comments they would like to share with the group?
John Fitzgerald here. How realistic or feasible do you think it is? Do you think it will be for to bring back a significant degree of manufacturing from Asia back onshore to Australia? So you have key suppliers. With all the cost constraints in the past, every manufacturing of consumer goods is long gone offshore. Okay, now this crisis is seen that the just-in-time model is not working, but there's a weighing up of your cost factor, but also you need to be able to service your customers. You need to be able to manage the supply chain. My question, Australia, the cost is a significant disadvantage. So have has your company done any work in any sectors and saying, look, to assess for clients the feasibility of reshoring, like manufacturing?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I've had a few conversations around this recently, Barry, and I'll just put in my 2 cents on that, and others feel free to contribute as well. There's a few lenses on this. One is it will be interesting to see what the government does do around identification of critical infrastructure, because the issue is if left to pure market dynamics and market forces, if the focus is purely on profitability, and we've had a long period of relative stability, then a lot of those resiliency and protective measures get removed. So I guess what would be interesting to me is that if the government did nothing and everything kind of returns to normal in 5 years, would anything really be different? I'd say probably not. Because I think there's a couple things is that, it's fine to say that the research shows that businesses that have more resiliency bounce back after a crisis and tend to perform better. So, if you looked at like the pan pharmaceutical recall, it's a much smaller kind of example. The pan pharmaceutical recall in Australia in 2003, Blackmore has had a really good operational SOP process in place, which they ran really fast and were able to communicate and kind of figure out what was happening and respond to supply much faster. And their market share went up by 30% and actually remained. So they did quite well, and that persisted following that crisis. But then the question becomes is how frequently do you expect this to happen? And that's where it comes into it. But I do believe that there'll be some reviews of what the government might now consider fundamental infrastructure. If you do like what other countries did following, say, SARS overseas, there were some changes in those local economies that allowed them to kind of deal with this much better this time. So I think some things will happen. I can't say what. So I think that's one point. The second point is if the investment community starts looking into resiliency as a valuation measure, that could definitely change things in terms of capital allocation as well.
Yep.
Watch that space. And in terms of what individual companies do, I think there will be something around resilience, but I'm not sure that will be played out in terms of reshoring manufacturing. And to answer your original question, do we do a lot of that sort of work? We do a lot of supply chain strategy work in terms of network design and sourcing questions and flow models, but it's not a question we get asked very much, to be blunt. Not many people come to us and say, what would be the benefit of reshoring? We'd love to do that sort of work, but there hasn't been a real demand for that, in the last couple of decades.
Okay, thank you.
The answer also not necessarily might be reshoring, but it could be assessing the criticality of some of the key inputs that you're sourcing and maybe getting a dual or secondary supplier, or assessing how long, if it's not short shelf life, how maybe increasing the holdings to see how long you can cope through a particular catastrophic event like a pandemic.
Stock ridge, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that might involve.
Yeah, and John, the other thing that's often missed, I mean, it's a more subtle point, but I think a lot of times is the issue around demand variability doesn't get picked up in these sorts of discussions. So in other words, a business will say, it's a lower cost supply chain because it's longer, but we don't, and that might be true if it's a very stable product, but if you're in a highly volatile demand market, if you go from a 3-day lead time to a 12-week lead time, the amount of safety stuff you have to carry goes through the roof. And I guess we've done some work in doing those sorts of valuations, sometimes through private equity businesses, and again, it's offshoring. But typically the actual costs of the increase in supply chain and demand variability that have to be built in aren't actually built into the models up front. So I think that's another place to look because it's often missed.
Yeah.
Can I just, Nigel's put his hand up. Nigel, do you have something you'd like to share?
So yeah, I was just wondering, given that we seem to be moving towards holding more safety stock, bringing more stock in, manufacturing more on site, how does our warehousing capacity fit within that regard?
It's a great question, Nigel. David, you want to field that one?
Yeah, so I guess if we're moving to more safety stock, then there will be an increase in warehousing need. There's been a lot of pressure on industrial warehousing recently, especially from the online space because of increasing demand and short-term needs. But a lot of this really comes down to, I guess, the scenario modelling that was discussed earlier, but in different form. So it's a pretty simple exercise to look at increasing safety stocks. What's the impact? But it is a step change usually with the warehouse. You either exceed capacity of your current facilities, you put pressure on your third-party provider if you have a dedicated contract, we have dedicated space. And large scale, that's normally what happens. So the in-house or third-party provider is assigning specific space to you, and it's a step change to go to a bigger facility or to split your holdings. So some scenario modelling, Carter mentioned we do a lot of network modelling. That scenario modelling of increasing safety stocks and what is the best way to achieve it, when are my current leases expiring, etc. But at the moment, there is an uncertainty from our, relationship with real estate Knight Frank guys around there will be, a drop in demand potentially from companies who have struggled as a result of COVID-19, and that will free up potentially some industrial space. But on the other side, there's been a lot of pressure on industrial space from the online market recently. So what does that mean in terms of available capacity and the cost of warehousing space? It's a bit unknown going into the future, and it's the usual keep an eye on the market, as Carter's points earlier, observe the market, see what's happening, and is there opportunity to get, additional space to address that sort of planned increase in stock when the market's a bit softer, rather than wait till the market's booming again. But it does need scenario analysis of, a range of options that are available.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Got a question from Linda from the chat group. Linda, do you want to share that? Or I can read it out if that.
Yes. So my question is in relation to the point at the very end of the discussion about scenario modelling, and that businesses don't typically do it often or necessarily do it very well. And some of the scenarios that may be necessary given what we've talked about, like onshoring or potentially different kinds of collaboration, could have a fairly material impact on the business, but also quite a material shift from their current model. So my question is, what role do you see boards needing to play in this scenario modeling, scenario planning process?
That's it. Look, I think that's a great question. I'm really glad you've asked that, because I mean, I think it ties into a couple of things I said before about, and it's not the answer, but it ties into the investment community's view of resilience.
Yep, great point.
Yeah, and also what the government's response is. But I think if we just go back to the view of corporate governance, and I mean, if we're talking about, you know, the long-term viability and sustainability of the business, and you know, and success, that might be some. I'd be interested to see if that could even be included in say the roadmap, which is what are the key scenarios that we need to be navigating, and what is the business's response to that. So.
Carter, your audio went maybe a bit strange there. Can you repeat that?
Thank you.
What was the last thing that you heard, Dan?
Yeah.
That's what I said. So, I mean, what's the problem? When I don't have a good answer, I just press that button and it makes a static noise. No, I'd say, Linda, it would be something I could see the board building into the corporate governance process. And yeah, I think you'd be just asking some questions. You know, what are those key scenarios? What are the business's response? What are the financial implications? What's possible, not possible? And if not possible leads us to a bad conclusion, what can we do to make that a viability? It's built into that framework. And what I'd love to do at this stage, I just want to be clear on time. I'm very happy to stay on for a bit longer and continue the conversation if anybody would like to continue. But I'd say in terms of the formal webinar, given that we said it would finish at 10:30, I'll just formally close that at this point. So if anyone needs to go, please feel free. And if you do, thank you so much for your time and participation. Really, really appreciate that. Great to have you guys. And again, I'm happy to stay on for another 15 or so minutes if we want to continue the discussion. So what about you and David? Are you guys?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Okay, for those who are staying on, I think Matt, you've got a question for the group or a comment?
Thanks, Dan. First comment is gratitude. Thanks for putting this on, because it's actually a thought promoter for, you know, we've had bushfires where people didn't want to insure their houses. Price does tend to be a mechanism that Gordon Gekko believes that covers everything, but it doesn't. There's muscle memory in businesses. We maximize profit, we minimize stock on hand, we maximize service levels, we minimize time to deliver, and they're our KPIs. But there's inherently and the global financial crisis with dodgy mortgages showed us that we inadequately price risk. And I know that we've got textbooks, all of us have got them, on lead time variability, demand variability, and Medcon. I heard the guy on in my day it was called 3LO 774 Melbourne being interviewed with the army there, helping him out. And in terms of how we manage that going forward as a business or a society, I guess it's who prices the risk, do they do it adequately, and who pays the price, I think is the ultimate question. Is a business going to do it, and should they assume someone else isn't going to do it? I think the public good and private good economics textbook that we've also got somewhere up there, don't assume anybody else is going to do it. So you need to have that Kraft bought all of their peanuts until they had a drought and a flood in Queensland, and then they had to buy them from Venezuela or something. So, it's the inadequate ability to price risk means that you cut costs everywhere. And I guess the ongoing thing is who's got the appetite for paying for that insurance? Like, we've even got people drawing down their own superannuation. Like, that's insurance for the future. That we've got people's muscle memory for all sorts of things, like carrying stock on hand in case, like having toilet paper in your house, stock on hand. What has gone on there? And in terms of retailers, I think, their behaviour is always going to be the same. It's let's push the risk down to the suppliers. I go back to the global financial crisis on dodging mortgages. How do you get, and where I'm very thankful for your very, very detailed insights in this presentation, how do you get into the nuts and bolts of actually quantifying what your risk is and putting the thinking cap on? And I'm grateful for you guys for putting this on.
Thank you. Carter, do you want to take that one?
Oh, man.
It was a comment, not a question.
That's a good one. I think you've opened up something much bigger, which is, the value set of a society, really. It's a much bigger question. I hear that and agree. I suppose, you mentioned the textbook. We're all part of a system that really, if you look at the kind of world we live in, at least in the first world, it's called capitalism. It's basically the highest value is money. And if I could be so blunt, I think somewhere along the way we lost culture and community. So risk. What do we mean by risk as well? What's risk? Risk is actually, there's a bunch of technical definitions, but when we're talking about risk here, we're talking about something kind of falling apart. And when something falls apart, there's a bunch of human beings that are impacted by that. So I have a very strong view that my hope is that some understanding that, quote unquote, we're all in this together, and that the way we treat one another is the way we treat ourselves. And like you said, there is no avoiding it. There's no way of, you sort of don't want to outsource all your risk just to your neighbors, because you don't want to live in that neighborhood when things go badly. So I don't have a short answer, but I think changing a value set from acquisition, separation, and hierarchy and accumulation to one that was more about inclusion, well-being, and health would be wonderful.
And I think even from a more capitalistic point of view, if I build upon Carter and Linda's previous comments, it's the role of boards and organisations. If we're starting to value risk then rather than just working capital reductions, then maybe we'll get less pressure to reduce our stock holdings constantly, or supermarkets pushing that responsibility back onto the suppliers. Then we will start hopefully valuing risk as a more tangible item on our balance sheets that will then change behaviour that hopefully will allow us to survive some of these sort of catastrophic events.
Yeah, it's interesting, Matt, your point. Some of this came up when the Australian Defence Forces has been kind of moving through kind of a larger outsourcing process over the last, again, couple of decades. And there was a big question in that, which is an interesting one, which is, so if you outsource part of your defense operations to a contractor and things go badly, do you think your contract will hold up in an Indonesian court? That was a question around, like, so how much risk can you actually outsource? Because at that point, all bets are off. So it is a great question.
I think the point though, Carter, is you don't outsource the risk. Outsourcing functions and activities can increase your risk, and you need to be mindful of those risks. And as I listen to some of these comments, I think of the lean versus agile supply chain, and we're continually trying to find the balance where you satisfy the customer responsive, but you do it as leanly as possible. I think there'll be a rebalancing of risk, and it's not a flip from one end to the other. It's trying to take, we've been, ignoring risks that have now been highlighted and it will be how much do we turn the dial towards risk mitigation and get that right balance that says we've been sourcing from one supplier in China, let's get one in Vietnam. It might come at, at a 5-10% premium or something else, but it may be dual source of supply. It may be changing the dynamic of our product mix to mitigate some of those risks, and paying a smaller premium along the way, but having that flexibility where you can respond and push increased demand on, and also supply. It's been very common in the past to have, dual supply, and some of our customers, it's paramount. They insist on doing it, but the more and more pressure there is on price points from customers, the more we try and become lean, the more that dual supply disappears into, put it all in one place. It's simpler, it's easier to manage, but it comes with a higher risk. So I think there'll be a balancing that will shift away from where we have been.
And Linda, do you mind sharing, expanding on your comment you shared to the group?
And so the note I put was the flip side of risk is opportunity, right? So I don't have a wealth of experience in business continuity recovery, but I have had the roof in one of my warehouses collapse under a hailstorm. And so the work that you put in to mitigate a risk often then creates an opportunity. And I think it's back to Carter's point about the investment community view, increasingly aware of risk in the event that you don't have adequate continuity plans, adequate dual supply, to David's point. So I do wonder if regulator, ARC, investment community, insurers are going to be asking those more reaching questions about what if. And I suppose we have a golden moment where a number of parties are aware of the benefits of having paid that tiny premium for resilience, because they then have an opportunity. And I loved David's point about the balance between lean and agile. So yeah, I think it's a whole different mindset that's going to emerge around what ifs. And we're often told at the board that we need to push that risk appetite. And sometimes it is setting us up for an opportunity that may come, which is quite uncomfortable because you don't know when the opportunity will come. But I can see the tension between risk and opportunity being discussed in a much more tangible way going forward.
It is a mindset shift. I think a chain of responsibility. Boards have become very aware of chain of responsibility. So that's moved from the supervisor of the truck driver to suddenly the board's being held accountable and understanding their responsibility. And as shareholders and investors consider those sorts of things and become more aware of it, this is an area of different risk that I think will start to play out more importantly.
Yes, and your healthcare example at the beginning of the presentation about a supply chain in a healthcare environment not having the level of scrutiny or the process or the quality or the sourcing components that enabled it to work under pressure. So I guess, yeah, more pressure testing in some of these supply chain scenarios. It's great.
I've got a question about the potential role types, Dan or Carter or David, that you've heard out there. So supply chain profile is definitely raised, and my mum even knows what I recruit now, given the government's talking about global supply chains and the impact. Do you anticipate any new fancy or sexy supply chain roles that organisations look to plug in, whether it be for a short-term period or a fixed-term period, to optimise global supply chains, or anything else that you're hearing in your conversations?
Yeah, I think
ambulance chaser.
I mean, the idea of the nerve center, the supply chain center of excellence. I mean, supply chain center of excellence is kind of an older term, but if we kind of apply it to the now, it's really people who I guess are data and process savvy and have kind of an interdisciplinary view of supply chain and can help kind of run that OODA process, which is the observe, orient, decide, and act. And again, I mean, so I do think it's possibly a quote unquote new role, because as much as we've got demand and supply balancing type S&OP processes out there at some level, and some businesses have some level of financial integration, still most of those don't have that actual scenario planning capability. So I really do think that's yeah, we did a white paper and a presentation on that a couple of years ago, just saying that our prediction was that that would soon be just, you know, a fundamental competitive advantage, but right now it was still a very much a competitive advantage, but it was kind of the next frontier. So if anything, I think this situation will kind of hasten the awareness of the need of that capability and its lack. Yeah. Again, the question is that if we couldn't take our existing processes to answer these questions, then we fundamentally don't have those processes and capabilities. So, yeah, John, I haven't seen anyone ask that question yet, but if I was kind of thinking about what's going to be seen as a capability gap, that's probably a big one.
It's probably, we spent the last 5, 8, maybe 10 years taking heads out, making supply chains leaner. Certainly something we've seen is that supply chain capability role is not disappearing, but that centre of excellence hasn't been as well resourced as it has in the past. Maybe that will also bring it back. John, you're probably seeing the explosion of data scientists and the need for all those. I think this just might exacerbate that.
Yeah. Because it's interesting, even the S&OP or IBP role, I took a brief with a large FMCG company last Friday for an IBP manager. And if I think back to when I was recruiting an S&OP manager 10 or 12 years ago, the challenges in the brief were relatively similar. So even that role itself and the evolution, there are parts to it, but the challenges in some companies still just not getting it right, and the same brief and challenges is quite interesting. So that could, you know, roll into other parts of the supply chain as well.
Yeah, John, I see the challenges for you that businesses don't actually know what they want. They want a silver bullet, and they want a demand planner that's a VRP, that's a S&OP manager, that's a CFO, that's everything else. So good luck to you.
Thank you. I think I might need it.
Thank you, everybody. I'm grateful for you putting this on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, Carter, maybe over to you to just close.
Yeah, again, and thank you all for making the time. John and I talked about this last week, this notion of kind of webinar fatigue that I think's been happening. So thank you so much for choosing to be here today. It's been really great to connect with you guys in this forum. And for me, the part I've enjoyed the most is the discussion here at the end. So thanks for your comments.
Thanks for being my extended family for today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Carter. Thanks, Dan. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.